เรียนแขกผู้มีเกียรติทุกท่านนะครับก็ช่วงต่อไปนะครับก็จะเป็นช่วงของการฟังปาฐกถานะครับของศาสตราจารย์ดร. อาร์เธอร์ Kleinman นะครับในหัวข้อ Care for Memories The Anthropology of Aging, Dementia and Death การดูแลความทรงจำมนุษยวิทยาแห่งการสูงวัยภาวะสมองเสื่อมและความตายซึ่งอาจารย์ได้ใช้ประสบการณ์ตรงนะครับในฐานะแพทย์ด้านจิตเวชนะครับและเป็นนักมนุษยวิทยานะครับในการดูแลภรรยาของอาจารย์ที่เผชิญกับภาวะโรคสมองเสื่อมนะครับซึ่งสะท้อนความซับซ้อนและความยากลำบากในการให้การดูแลและการได้รับการดูแลนะครับในมิติทางอารมณ์และศีลธรรมรวมถึงได้นำเสนอความคิดใหม่ๆเกี่ยวกับระบบการดูแลสุขภาพที่พิจารณาความต้องการทั้งทางร่างกายและจิตใจของผู้ป่วยนะครับแล้วก็ผู้ดูแลด้วยในทุกส่วนของกระบวนการนะครับอาจารย์ไคลแมนนะครับเป็นจิตแพทย์และนักมนุษยวิทยาดำรงตำแหน่งศาสตราจารย์ด้านสุขภาพโลกและเวชศาสตร์สังคมในมหาวิทยาลัยฮาร์วาร์ดสำเร็จการศึกษาจากมหาวิทยาลัยสแตนฟอร์ดและวิทยาลัยการแพทย์มหาวิทยาลัยสแตนฟอร์ดแล้วก็อาจารย์ได้สอนอยู่ที่มหาวิทยาลัยฮาร์วาร์ดเป็นเวลากว่า47ปีนะครับนอกจากนี้อาจารย์ไคลแมนยังได้เขียนหนังสือหลายเล่มเกี่ยวกับมนุษยวิทยาการแพทย์นะครับอาทิ The Illness Narrative Suffering Healings and the Human Condition นะครับในปี1988ซึ่งเป็นหนังสือที่แพร่หลายนะครับในวงการนะครับอาจารย์ได้สำรวจวิเคราะห์เรื่องราวเกี่ยวกับโรคภัยนะครับผู้คนที่ประสบในชีวิตประจำวันนะครับแล้วก็ผ่านเรื่องของประสบการณ์ทางการแพทย์ด้านมนุษยวิทยาซึ่งอาจารย์เนี่ยได้สนใจเรื่องราวที่บอกเล่าของการป่วยนะครับรวมถึงไม่ว่าจะเป็นเรื่องของความเจ็บป่วยความรู้สึกอับอายนะครับกระบวนการการหายเป็นปกติหรือว่าเสนอเรื่องราวของผู้ป่วยโรคร้ายแรงนะครับแล้วก็วิเคราะห์ว่าเรื่องราวเหล่านี้ทำไมจึงสำคัญนะครับต่อการศึกษาและการฟื้นฟูสุขภาพรวมไปถึงสำรวจการตอบสนองของระบบการดูแลสุขภาพแล้วก็ต่อความทรงจำว่าทางสังคมนะครับว่าสำคัญอย่างไรต่อประสบการณ์ชีวิตนะครับแล้วก็หนังสือเล่มล่าสุดของอาจารย์ The Soul of Care The Moral Education of a Husband and a Doctor นะครับก็จะเกี่ยวข้องกับหัวข้อที่อาจารย์จะมานำเสนอในปาฐกถาวันนี้ด้วยนะครับอาจารย์ไคลแมนได้รับรางวัล France Boas Award ซึ่งเป็นรางวัลสูงสุดของสมาคมมนุษยวิทยาอเมริกันรวมถึงเคยทำงานวิจัยภาคสนามนะครับในจีนและไต้หวันแล้วก็ยังเป็นผู้บุกเบิกด้านมนุษยวิทยาการแพทย์ทั้งในแง่ของแนวคิดทฤษฎีและการประยุกต์ใช้ในวงการแพทย์และสุขภาพอีกด้วยนะครับ Dear honor speaker, guests and esteemed colleagues, this is my distinct honor to welcome to you to the SAC Annual Anthropological Conference 2024. Today we gather to embark on a profound journey in the human condition, guided by eminent Professor Arthur Kleinman. Our keynote lecture titled Care for Memories, The Anthropology of Aging, Dementia and Death promises to illuminate the deepest recesses of our shared experience. Professor Kleinman, a towering figure in medical anthropology, will lead us through the intricate interplay of memory, caregiving, and bereavement. Arthur Kleinman is one of the most renowned and influential scholars and writers on psychiatry, anthropology, global health, and cultural and humanistic issues in health and medicine. Educated at Stanford University and Stanford Medical School, he has taught at Harvard for 47 years, and he is currently a professor in global health and social medicine and a professor in psychiatry and at Harvard Medical School, and Esther and Sidney Rapp's professor of anthropology in Harvard's Faculty of Arts and Science, and has also conducted field research in China and Taiwan as well. With France Boas Award, the highest award of the American Anthropological Association, he is a pioneer in medical anthropology, both theoretical concepts and their application in medical and health contexts. Drawing from his extensive research and forthcoming book, Professor Kleinman will explore how acts of care center on memories that can revitalize both individuals and communities. He will reveal how personal memories intersect with social relations and cultural practices, offering us new perspective on aging and death. It is with great anticipation and respect that we welcome Professor Arthur Kleinman to the stage. Thank you.
Well, respected guests, distinguished colleagues, leaders of this wonderful center and of this conference, it's my honor to be here today. I've come here really, to be honest with you, to celebrate one of my former students, one of my great former students, who you're celebrating as he moves toward the end of his tenureship as the director of this wonderful center. It was my great honor to teach medical anthropology to Dr. Komatra Chongsadyentsap and to watch him develop. I've had more than 100 PhD students, more than 250 postdoctoral fellows, and only 2 of them have had nicer offices than me. One was Jim Kim when he was president of the World Bank, and the other one is Dr. Komatra. I want to talk today, as you've heard, about the care for memories. It's really about the impact of death on life, the kind of understanding, the sort of wisdom that comes with aging, with care of those who lose their memories owing to dementia, and in encountering death. Now, I have over the course of my career written and edited or co-edited 40 books. And all of these books, in a way, point toward the direction of this talk. In December of last year, December 2023, I also edited a special issue of the Journal of the American Academy of Arts and Sciences called Deadless on mental health, which also points in this direction. Now, in my early work, I was concerned with the meanings of illness and did a book that was widely taught in medical schools around the world called The Illness Narratives. And it was about the interpretation of disease and illness by doctors, patients, and caregivers. And it was centrally arguing that narratives of experience was how we understood illness, diagnosed disease, and responded with care. And these were just some of the kinds of concerns I had when I was a young medical anthropologist, understanding how culture and social structural factors like poverty affect symptoms, how illness becomes part of the core symbols of a society, how we can understand explanation through the models of illness and disease, how we can look at suffering in its local worlds and at emotions and affective states. In 1999, kind of in the middle of my career, I was privileged to give the Tanner lectures at Stanford, my alma mater. And in the Tanner lectures, I tried to explain what were the characteristics of the human experience in terms of our local worlds that we live in, grow up in, are socialized through, their impact on our inner worlds, and the way we get at experience, life experience. So my concern, if you're following my reasoning, was never really with stories and narratives per se, but we're seeing them as an opening, a crack, as it were, in the facade of our lives, looking at the depth of our experience. And it's the experiences themselves, those deep, individualized and socialized, historicized, aesthetized experiences that I wanted to get at. And I wanted to see them in the kinds of the perilous times that we always live in. In every age, we recognize the dangers of our time. Some proceed from age to age and are the kinds of things that are the substance of religion, of philosophy. Others are acute, historically based problems in the economy with regard to job security, joblessness, poverty. Others are health related. Any medical student, when he or she is in medical school, reading textbooks of pathology, are astonished at the thousands and thousands of disorders that there are in the world, and wonder how we get through life without any of us succumbing to all the different diseases. So you're aware, we're constantly aware of accidents, of catastrophes that are part of the perilousness, not just of this time, but of every age. And here in that Tanner lectures, I wanted to emphasize the importance of moral experience and point out that it was based in the social life around us, in the groups that we belong to. That life is always about values, things are always at stake. It's the practice of what is at stake that was the focus of my work. So different than just saying what's important to us, seeing how the things we do, the lives we live, the way we practice living, shows, demonstrates, illustrates our values. That is moral experience. But each of us, in addition to that, has a moral life. That moral life frequently is strongly influenced by, shaped by, and contributes to the moral experience of the groups we belong to, which now, of course, are not just villages or neighborhoods or even networks that are local. They can be transcontinental networks, but they are connections that matter deeply to us. That moral life also can be based in a recognition that moral experience that we're swimming in, that we're living in, is counter in its values to what we really feel inside. I think of this easily in terms of a medical situation in which you see a clinic that has the terms serve the people. In China, where I do my research, it's wei renmen fu wu, serve the people. But when you go to the clinic, you see that the actual practices represent a different set of values, which is generating funds, generating money. And then you realize that the moral experience of the group is not really about helping people, but it's about making wealth for the people who run the clinic. And then the moral life of the person is in contradiction, if in fact you're the kind of person, as I'm sure many in this audience are, who want to care and help people in the world. And that contradiction, in my view, takes us out of the moral space and puts us into the ethical domain. Because the ethical is our aspiration for something translocal that goes beyond the local moral into another domain. Many societies around the world understand that movement toward the ethical as a movement toward abstract principles, good abstract principles like social justice, social equity, health equity, and the like. But the ethical, when we think about it, is always pre-organized for us by religion, by the profession of ethics, by professional ethicists. So when we enter that ethical space, that translocal space, it may not actually accord with what we ourselves feel in our moral life. And it's that discrepancy that has always been interesting to me, particularly as it relates to social suffering. And years ago, with my anthropological colleagues, Veena Das and Margaret Locke, I put together a book on social suffering that emphasized that pain and suffering are frequently caused by social forces, global and local economics, politics, social institutions, social relationships, culture. That the interpersonal experience of suffering, which we tend to see as individual, is actually, as I just said, interpersonal. It's between the person who suffers and those around her who give care, who are concerned about her. So it's not just individuals who suffer, but it's interpersonal. Society and institutions, in the desire to respond to suffering, nonetheless, sometimes create programs, policies, and institutions themselves that actually make suffering worse. That was also part of our understanding of social suffering. Indeed, a lot of global health today in its work is to show how the colonial roots of global health often led to the development of institutions like the World Bank, the World Health Organization, which were more concerned in some ways with the politics of the globe and the politics of medicine than they were with the situation of the poor and those without voices in the margins. We were particularly interested in that book in violence as social suffering. We're all aware of violence in war, in aggressiveness, and people assaulting one another. But one of the points we made was that there's a violence of everyday life. And my great former student, Paul Farmer, who became an icon of medical humanitarianism, made the point that this violence of everyday life came out of the deepest forms of poverty, which opened individuals, families, communities to the violence of suffering. And all that was the basis for getting at the subject that was in my most recent book, The Soul of Care, which is caregiving, the response to that suffering. So I began by defining caregiving using the Oxford English Dictionary as really two things. On the one hand, the actual acts of care, but on the other hand, the caring that we learn, that we're socialized into as part of our attention to the world and to others, our worrying, our concern for families, for friends, for communities, for our world, for our planet. Defined ethnographically, as opposed to in a dictionary, caregiving is both the individual and collective human process of giving care, meaning protecting, supporting, being in solidarity with. And it has physical, emotional, interpersonal, and moral dimensions. And caregiving is reciprocal. It's incredibly important to understand that. It's very easy reading books like my own about the care provided to, in my case, to my late spouse who had early onset Alzheimer's disease, and to look at the caregiver but forget the person who is receiving the care. And yet that person receiving the care is actively present in the care, even if they are demented, do not recognize the person giving care. Their presence is still there. You hear the tone of it, the tone of it. I just came from 2 weeks in China, and I used an expression there which I'm going to use now because I think it's the best example of this. I'm sure there's a Thai expression which would do the same thing, but since I don't speak Thai, regrettably, this is the best I can do. The Chinese have a story about a lute player. It's in several places, especially in the Zhuangzi. And the lute player is great at one of the great musicians playing his lute. But he always plays for a friend. He always plays for a friend. The friend dies, and the lute player takes his lute and hangs it up and never plays again. And when people say to him, "But you were such a great lute player, you're such a fantastic musician, why did you stop playing when your friend died?" And the lute player uses two terms. He says, "Only he, my friend, could jur yin, could hear the tone, could hear the tone." Okay? You know that in everyday life. That tone is the relationship. It's the quality of the relationship. It's that which stands behind the words. It's the experience behind the narratives that connects to our memories, to our very bodily processes. Now, I'll just give some examples of this from my own tradition, the Western tradition, and a few others. In the West, caregiving officially, in terms of nurses, came out of Christianity. And the early hospices, hospitals, all came out of religious institutions, and it was nuns who largely played the role of giving the care. Caregiving is not just about the actions of the caregiver, the protecting, the supporting, the helping with feeding. Those are critical. Caregiving is also about the spirit of the caregiver. And I think that Rembrandt's picture of a doctor of his time captures that quality in the face of the doctor, a kind of incipient sadness, a kind of recognition of the difficulties of life, a kind of readiness to explore with another the pain and suffering that's part of why people need care. And to illustrate just the interpersonal quality of care, this is another Rembrandt of a family member sitting at the bedside. And this is the classical Christian portrayal of that. The dying or dead Christ in the body of the Virgin, with the space between being the space of care, that interpersonal space of care. And in my country, where the experience of African Americans has been one of the most devastating experience through slavery of suffering, African American writers often use that religious metaphor to talk about care by talking about time on the cross, that African Americans were crucified through the experience of slavery. But in a more ordinary presentation would be like this one we see here. A middle-aged or older adult child with her mother or father, usually mothers, because women live longer. Again, representing in that space the fact that suffering is never individualized. It's always between people. And then one of the great attempts, a heroic, brave, remarkable attempt by a great painter, a Swiss painter, to paint his own Alzheimer's disease as he went through the experience. And you can see the portrayal begins with a recognizable painting of himself and slowly is deconstructed as his skills as a painter are undermined, as his cognition and affect change. But that there's something still there, even when he is seriously disabled by dementia. There's something present in him. And here, from a wonderful NGO that's anthropologically based in the United States called Partners in Health, that was started by Paul Farmer, an AIDS patient in Lesotho, one of the poorest countries in the world, in Southern Africa, surrounded by her family, dying of AIDS, in pain, but surrounded by her family. And I think we all recognize this. So all of this engagement with experience and this questioning of its relationship to narratives and meanings brought to mind a question for me. What are the limits to illness narratives and meaning? To begin with, many of the accounts are physician-based. So maybe they're missing something from the voice of those who are ill, but on the other side of the doctor-patient relationship. There are different genres in illness narratives. Some of them are simply straightforward discussions of sickness. Some of them are family members' accounts, etc. They're all telling stories that are meant to get at something. What are they trying to get at? Daniel Ofri, an American physician who's a marvelous contributor to studies of physicians and to the field of medical humanities, has argued that there's a kind of sensibility that doctors strive for and some achieve that makes them aware of the juriyin, of the hearing the tone beyond the stories. And of course, it's important here to recognize that it's the feelings of all that count. I think if anthropology did something to me over the 55 years that I've been an anthropologist, it's to make me realize that we are all in this together, that we all count, that each of us count, and that it's the feelings that we have, that everyone has in their interactions, which we have to recognize as central to what counts in our life. Now, these are two interesting paintings to illustrate what I'm talking about. On your right side, is the only time that Picasso sought to paint the head of a medical student. Okay? It's the only time he did that, only one painting. This hangs in Barcelona in the Picasso Museum, which has the wonderful paintings from his early life. And you'll see that what's interesting about it is that one eye is closed and one eye is open. And a point often made by art critics is that one eye is closed to protect the doctor against being overwhelmed by suffering, so that she can face up to it without falling apart. And the other eye is open to that suffering in order to be able to engage it. And it's been said today that in medicine, one of the problems we have is that both eyes are shutting. Okay. The other painting is just thrown in there as a cautionary tale I'm not entirely sure of what I just said is exactly Picasso's intention. This was a painting during the Chinese Cultural Revolution. And the painter claimed that he just wanted to present an owl because sometimes they sleep with one eye open, he claimed. But the Chinese government consulted with ornithologists who told them owls never sleep with one eye open. They always have two eyes open. So they accused this painter of winking at the political system. Anyway, it suggests an uncertainty. That's why I'm presenting it to you. An uncertainty that is also part of our human experience of suffering, illness, disease, and care. So I see care and caregiving as an existential act that defines our humanity and our relationship with others. It is one of the things that truly matters in our life. Therefore, from the way I have defined morality, it is always moral because it is at stake for us in our relationship with others. It's also a basic response to the dangers and uncertainties that define our human experience everywhere. There's a tendency for economists to look at caregiving and write about it always as a burden. But if you speak to the people who are experiencing caregiving, they will tell you, yes, it is burdensome, but for them it's a way of being in the world. It's the way that they're doing things. It's a basic aspect of moral experience and ethical aspiration. I've written this years ago, but I think it still stands. In a global culture of cynicism and sense of misplaced loyalty, caregiving is frequently perceived as one of the truly worthy objects of ethical commitment. Now, the practice of caregiving on a practical level actually has relatively little to do with medicine, or even for that reason in my country today with nursing. Doctors are removed from caregiving much of the time in the United States. And nurses also, though they play a central, a vital role in care, are so busy with the organizational activities, with the management, with filling out questionnaires, they also have limited time in caregiving. It's the families, it's the nursing assistants, it's the home health aides, it's the wider social network that are responsible for day-to-day realities of caregiving. There are multiple levels of caregiving, and it's worth thinking about this anthropologically so that we don't just end up essentializing the doctor-patient or the family-patient relationship. There's a humanitarian assistance, which is caregiving at the collective level. There's the professional caregiving I've talked about. There's self-care, the care that we give ourselves. There's family and network caregiving, which are so very important. There's folk and religious healing. I want to point to family and network caregiving because this is one area where I have made a small contribution. In 1970, I started my field research in Taiwan. And I began by trying to understand what is a healthcare system. I spoke to the Minister of Health at that time, and he said to me, you know, a healthcare system is hospitals, clinics, pharmacies. It's doctors and nurses and social workers. And I said, okay, that's interesting to hear. And then I went out to look around. And one of the things that surprised me was that friends of mine who had a sick baby in the house were going to a local temple. In Taiwan, the temples are often combinations of Buddhism, Taoism, and Confucianism. And this person went to the local temple, which is called the Longshan Miao, or the Dragon Mountain Temple in Taipei. It's a big one, still there. And when I was inside that temple, I heard people praying or getting their fortunes told. And 70% of the time, they were asking about health-related matters. That meant that the temple itself was an institution relevant to health care. Surrounding the temple were clinics not just of Western medicine, but of traditional Chinese medicine, of bone setters, of herbalists, and a very wide set of religious institutions, meaning that all of that was the healthcare system. But even more fundamental to that was when I started doing research in families and found that 90% of all health matters were discussed in family settings where decisions were made whether to go for professional care or folk healing or other practices or not, whether to take medicines or not, what next to do. That made the family itself the single most important institution in healthcare. All of that had been left out of the way that the Minister of Health had described healthcare. It changed over time now as we've begun to realize that the informal healthcare system is as powerful as the formal healthcare system. I've borrowed here some slides since I'm giving this lecture in Thailand from a former student of mine, Felicity Aulino, who did her research in Thailand. So the pictures you're seeing at least come from Thailand, okay? But they illustrate exactly what my own pictures would have illustrated from China or the United States. The core tasks for family, close friends, and sufferers themselves are practical assistance. Practical assistance means helping to feed, bathe, ambulate a close person, a family member, or if it's a home health aide, their work doing that. Those are the crucial acts of care. But it also involves acknowledgement and affirmation. It's acknowledgement of the person as deserving care, and it's affirming their right to care and their importance to receive respect. It's about emotional support, and it's about moral solidarity and experience, as I've tried to indicate already. And there are additional aspects of core tasks of care, such as consultation and coordination with experts in other fields, such as in religion, etc. And one of the most important parts of it is presence, human presence. I want to emphasize this. In anthropology, the original work on presence was on the presence of divinity in rituals. And the great book in this area, there are many, but the great book that I think of is Gottfried Lienhardt's Divinity and Experience Amongst the Dinka in what is now the South Sudan, where he showed how the gods are materialized in experience, in the actual experience, and become present to people. But I'm talking about a different presence. I'm talking about our presence toward each other. Okay? We know that presence. We know that presence in the way we feel and act. But, you know, that presence is not just coming out of us. It's drawn out of us. It's drawn out of us by the person receiving care. That presence that we have. One of the saddest things in a hospital setting or clinic is to see professionals who treat the patient without presence in a mechanical way, as if we were making boxes rather than taking care of people. And presence, for me, is a very big reality. There's a huge amount of anthropological material today to support it. And what it supports is an understanding of the presence in caregiving that is the opposite, the very opposite of the American idea of resilience. Okay? So I don't believe that any of us are resilient. Okay? I believe resilience is a foolish Hollywood term. Okay? It's a term that is meant to show that we are rubber bands and you can stretch us as wide as you want and we will come back to the same shape without any change. Resilience. But in fact, if you take a rubber band and put that rubber band out in the hot sun, it becomes brittle. And when you stretch it, it breaks. I want to suggest to you, from my own experience and from 55 years of studying care, that we all break. We become broken in giving serious care to people who mean a great deal to us. That breaking is built into our memories. It's built into them as the understanding of what it is that has been lost when someone we love dies, that has been injured when during care by the difficulties and the pains and the inadequacy of care. That brokenness, as the songwriter, the late popular songwriter Leonard Cohen in his songs said, is what lets the light in. It's from that brokenness that each of us recognize a wisdom, not just about care, but about life itself. Now, I want to suggest the importance of the caring for memories. As we age, I'm 83 years of age as I speak to you now. You may have thought I was a young man, but actually I'm old, okay? As we age, we have a tremendous reserve of memories that are inside of us. And we spend increasing time not just cultivating them, but taking care of them, managing them, organizing them, trying to fill out a story about ourselves and about life, trying to make sense of our own world, our own small world, in terms of the bigger world that we recognize around us, trying to prepare ourselves for facing death. Okay. In dementia, those memories get muddled and disorganized. Part of the tragedy of dementia is that so disorganized do the memories become that we lose our orientation to the world around us, to the people who mean the most to us, and to our own selves. At the end of life, many people at the end of life are relating memories to important religious, moral, spiritual issues. death itself does not remove the caring of memories. Bereavement, that's mourning, is about loss and longing and the caring of memories. Those memories are so difficult, so hard to deal with, they become unbearable in some way. So that we learn over time, as we build distance from the emotional difficulties of care after someone dies, to be able to bear the unbearable in our lives, as we rework those memories and put them to use in sustaining us in the world that we're in. After that, we can always think of memories in two ways. There are collective memories and individual memories. The individual memories is what I've been talking about, but from an anthropological standpoint, collective memories are enormously significant. And those memories go with us through the rituals that define social life and that are particularly important at death and after death. Those memories are reworked in those rituals. If I had time here, and if I were a little more advanced in the book I'm currently writing, I'd be able to tell you exactly how they change as we go through what Victor Turner once described as the movement, the tripartite movement of a ritual. When we're announced to be in a certain state, in this particular case, one of loss, then we grieve in culturally appropriate ways, and that loss is remade. But the remaking is actually in the memories themselves. And then we enter a third state where we are defined as no longer in that state of loss. One of the most magnificent examples of this comes from the Coast Salish in the United States. When a woman dies, when a woman's husband dies, that woman and all the members of her, female members of her age grade, put on colorful clothing for a day, then take it off, and then put on sackcloth. Sackcloth, they dress very poorly, covered in rags, basically. And they do that for a year until they return to that colorful clothing that they put on under the sackcloth in a ritual in which they, at the end, throw off the sackcloth. There are the colors, and they are supposed to indicate that the person has come out of a chrysalis, like a butterfly, and is reborn, and that woman is now a new person in her world, can remarry, can engage in all the acts appropriate to her, and so can all of her age grade. Now, I want to end by talking about a project I have right now, which may at the onset sound a little bit jarringly different, but is not. It illustrates how all of what I've talked about also relates to technology. Okay? So we live in a world of AI, VR, all kinds of technologies. And the great concern is, well, will the technologies interfere with our privacy? Will they lead to a world in which we are simply controlled by forces beyond us? And all these are reasonable fears for us to have, to do a better job in controlling the use of technologies. But one of the great fears of technology is that it will come to replace the human, that there will be a loss of the human through technologies. And there's some evidence of that. In medicine, we have some evidence that technologies have actually made care less supportive, less emotionally supportive, less attentive to the needs of patients. But I have a project that's trying to argue and develop evidence for the reverse. It's a project in China. It's called Social Technology for Global Aging at Harvard. And it's about elder care in China. It involves 20 professors from 12 from Harvard, 8 from Chinese universities. Most of those are former students of mine. It involves a variety of postdocs, graduate students, undergraduates, administrative staff, and regular meetings. And its concern is with using technologies to actually make care more human at the end of life in serious situations like dementia. And already, well before we started our work about 7 years ago, there are good examples of technologies that make care more human. One of the most impressive I've ever seen is in a village in Seoul, Korea, that Samsung, the electronic company, has developed that has a retirement setting, an assisted care setting, and a nursing home setting with cognitive care units for those who have dementia. And in the dementia cognitive care units, there are robots who work closely with people who have early onset dementia. And I watched several of these robots and was astonished by what they could do. First, they're programmed with software which makes them incredibly polite and supportive and humorous and engaged with people with dementia. And unlike us, human beings, the robot doesn't get frustrated. If you have ever worked with someone who has serious cognitive decline and tried to help them rethink things, cognitive retraining, it's very difficult not to get frustrated. Okay? The robot doesn't. And in the most polite of ways, supportively keeps going as long as the elderly want to keep going. And they want to keep going because of they feel the effects. And I was astonished to watch this and see how the robots actually increase the humanness of care rather than decreasing it. Of course, this doesn't mean that there'll be misuses. There will be of this. And we need to have laws and policies that control for those inappropriate or misuses. But I'm suggesting to you that the project that I'm engaged with is trying to do something different. For example, this is the first time in my life that I've worked directly with engineers. We put anthropologists, engineers, physicians, and design people together to work on projects from the beginning to the end. They design together, they implement together, and they evaluate together. Okay? And the results are quite impressive. We have one project in China relating to palliative care. Palliative care is very difficult in China for a number of reasons. One is the Chinese have a term, 不好意思, embarrassing. It's embarrassing and not thought as appropriate to speak to the elderly about death and dying. But if you don't speak to the elderly about death and dying, they have no input into advanced directives for how they'll be treated at the end of life. When you actually speak to the elderly, as I have, they already know that they're dying, even though families have tried to hide this from them. They want to be part, frequently, of discussions. They feel that it's their families that are holding them back from doing this. So figuring out how to engage that's one of the complexities of end-of-life care in China. We're calling it really now facing death rather than palliative care. A second component of palliative care in China is that because of China's extreme colonial abuse in being forced to through the opium wars to become addicted in huge numbers of people to opium, China has been incredibly concerned with the control of opioids. And if you don't have something like morphine available at end of life, you cannot take away people's pain. And if you can't take away pain, there's no palliative care. So one of the things that our anthropologists, together with engineers, developed is a virtual lockbox that places the morphine in a visible space so that everyone is accountable and you can see who has access to it and how it's used. And this is being seen as more acceptable to the use of morphine. Some of the other projects that we have in here are working with the elderly and those who care for them around various kinds of supports, from mechanical supports to help people climb stairs to exoskeletons which strengthen the arms of caregivers so that they can lift elderly people who are no longer able to do things together. And out of this came an incredibly interesting insight by one of our engineers who had brilliantly developed an exoskeleton for the legs that looks like a pair of thick pants tied to a battery and a motor and lets people with Parkinsonism and with post-stroke walk normally. It's an incredible device. We showed this to elderly women in Shanghai and asked them, what do you think? And they said, oh, it's great, but we would never use it, which shocked the engineer. How can you say it's great, but you would never use it? And they said, well, it's so dangerous to walk across the street in Shanghai, I would never trust pants to get me across the street. And the engineers kind of fell apart at that stage. The anthropologists then asked, well, what could we do for you if this is not going to be helpful? And with 90% agreement, elderly women said, look, I'm in my 90s. I have 6 friends in other high-rise buildings. We all have mobility problems. We can't get out of the apartment. We would like once a week to figure out a way of getting together and going to a tea house. If you could get us to do that and come back again, that would make all the difference in our lives. And that's what we're working on right now, how you would do that, not for 6, not for 60, not for 600, not for 6,000, but for 60,000 people, etc. How would you organize that? So that's part of that process that I've just described to you. And this was a symposium we've had that dealt with that. So let me end in the following regard. Anthropology is usually seen as the study of diversity across the world. I think in years to come, we're going to emphasize just as much human similarities. What I've presented to you today are similarities in virtually every country in the world that connect to the caring that's critical in our lives. I want to say that it's putting the two together, the idea of diversity and of cultural difference and the idea of universality, that makes the anthropological insight the strongest. And in the area of care, it suggests not just that caregiving is an impressive subject for us to continue studying, but that we need to improve care. And this is the other part of my anthropological concern. I believe that anthropology, especially medical anthropology, produces lessons that need to be put into the improvement of society. When social sciences were created by early thinkers who thought about systematic social knowledge, Voltaire, John Stuart Mill, Adam Smith, when they foresaw social science, they expected it to produce social knowledge to improve society and people's lives. What happened was that social science often turned away from that concern. This was particularly true of sociology, which developed the idea of social knowledge for its own sake. Okay? Through history, great social scientists, Max Weber, Hannah Arendt, Jane Addams, William James, John Dewey, C. Wright Mills, many, many others, W.E.B. Du Bois, they all argued that social knowledge had to be used to improve society and people's lives. And caregiving, as it relates to medical anthropology and anthropology more generally, shows us this is what needs to happen. It needs to happen not just through producing knowledge, like the social technology I'm talking about, that might be useful. It's also in the way we do our research. There's no methodology in my mind that's more open to the possibility of having care built into it than ethnography. One of the reasons that ethnography attracts so many doctors is that it looks like an idealized version of what doctors experience when they're with patients. They want to have that knowledge of the local context and the way that it affects someone, so that we can build into our ethnography care, so that we're not talking with a quote-unquote informant. We're not even talking with a quote-unquote interlocutor. We're working with a friend. We're working with a friend for whom we owe something. Something is drawn out of us. The stories we hear, the experiences we have access to, they in turn require a return of the gift. The gift is not just the moral strength of listening, recording, publishing. It's also giving care to that individual and that community. And I believe that that is crucial to anthropology, and it is why anthropology, as represented so beautifully, like a center, such as a center as this one, is still important in the world. Thank you very much.
Okay. Thank you very much, Professor Arthur Kleinman, for your keynote lecture. It was such a pleasure to have you here. And before ending this remark session, I would like Professor Arthur Kleinman remain on the stage for a few moments. We would like to take a few photographs to commemorate your visit. ลำดับถัดไปค่ะขอเรียนเชิญดร.ลาลีวรรณ กาญจนจารีค่ะผู้ช่วยรัฐมนตรีว่าการกระทรวงวัฒนธรรมขึ้นมอบของที่ระลึกค่ะ